Okay. Hot.
Hot mics.
Okay, Z-Man.
You could start.
Lay it on us. What are we talking about today?
Well, you can introduce us.
This is what we're talking about today. I am
Well,
Joe.
say whatever. Yeah.
And this is
Adam.
Bunky.
Bunky. Did your
And
voice just get deep? Hold on. Yeah, it did. Oh, Jesus. Joe just hit puberty, so that's nice that we were all witnesses to that. It's the stuff we're talking about today, and we've been discussing Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. We did the first two chapters. We're going to try to talk about chapters 3 and 4 together right now because they cover. They're similar. They're similar in title and they're similar in.
I still have deep voice
content. And can you want to tell us the title of chapter 3?
Chapter 3, Typographic America. And I didn't find this chapter too particularly interesting, but it lays a pretty good important foundation for what his argument is to come in the chapters down the line of establishing how we have moved from a culture oriented around print to what is now television. Hence the title of the book.
Yeah, and so chapters 1 and chapters 2 is what? Media is the message and
Metaphor.
Media is the metaphor and media as epistemology.
Yep.
Okay. And now we're gonna. You said Typographic America, and chapter 4 is Typographic Mind, right?
Yep.
Okay. So 3 opens with talking about the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, right? Do we want to go through anything in the beginning, or what are your? I know you said you're not interested in like history necessarily, so these weren't as fun of chapters, but you said they laid a good groundwork. Is there anything else that immediately you want to get out in the air?
There was maybe one thing. I had one quote saved here that was at the very end, but I'll just wait till we get to that point, so we can just work through chronologically a bit. Anything you thought was interesting?
Okay. This is the chapter where Postman is writing about the history of written word and literacy in colonial America, correct?
Correct.
One of the things he points out is that on the Mayflower, there were several books that were brought along, a main one being the Bible. I think in this chapter, the Bible is sort of the common thread that people who read, if we have a high literacy rate, it's largely due to Christianity and the Bible. Which is interesting from a amusing ourselves to death way. The Bible is sort of, I suppose, at that time taken as somewhat fact or a historical account, but I don't know. What was the key takeaway? Do you know the percentage of does he talk about what the literacy rate was at this time period in the 1600s or 1700s?
I'm not sure, but he did mention a statistic about in relation to the Bible, which you were just mentioning.
Yeah.
What did it say? It was right here. Between the years 1654 and 1699, all houses contained books, but 8% of them included more than just the Bible.
Yeah, it says 60% of estates had books, but only 8% had more than the Bible, which is So that's why it's so crazy. So it does say on that page 32 there that in England in 17th century, in the 1600s in England, they did not exceed a 40% literacy rate. And then in the New World, or in colonial America, I'm trying to find if it said what we achieved. Okay. Um, I think the point of bringing this up, literacy rates, is as he gives more examples, America had a particular mode of engaging that was largely fueled by the written word and being able to read. And that was sort of one thing that, helped America and establish the discourse that Postman thinks has vanished largely due to show business. I do want to say, though, and before we started recording, I mentioned that he's selective about his history, right? So if we're talking about literacy rate in men versus women or whatever in America, we're also not talking about Native people. We're not talking about slaves. We're not talking about certain we're largely talking about, white Protestant immigrants and settlers, but we're not talking about settlers that came from other areas other than like England or Spain or Italy. We're not talking about people that were already here. So it's a very narrowly defined demographic that doesn't represent the actual demographics of the time period. So the literacy rate was worse than he might have said at the time, just by nature of people not being allowed to read or learn to. So those marginalized groups of people. That doesn't make his point here any less important or meaningful. I just wanted to point that out. There's a quote here on 33 that's about I think it's, what was it, from Lewis Mumford, uh, talking about the printing press in the book, and it says, more than any other device, the printed book released people from the domination of the immediate and the local. Print made a greater impression than actual events. To exist was to exist in print. The rest of the world, he continues, the rest of the world tended gradually to become more shadowy. Learning became book learning. What do you think of that?
Well, I also think it's important to point out that in the beginning here, it was with the printing press, it was people largely weren't even reading books yet, which I think he pointed out. It was a lot of just the newspaper, so what was circulated among that.
Yeah.
Sorry, could you repeat your question?
Well, the big thing, the important part of that thing was to exist, was to exist in print. So it's starting to become the way we structure our belief systems and our reality is knowing about it and having a written record of events that have happened elsewhere, even if they're not happening in your town or they're happening in
Mm-hmm.
your city or your state, and while people, and I don't know if he covers this, I think he does, talks about, there were many a lie or slander or what libel or whatever it is in print. There was people who are doing that, but there is and Postman has been criticized as being sort of sanctimonious about print and the written word. But on one level, there is sort of a sanctity to it that, and this is shown by this Lewis Mumford quote, that to exist was to exist in print. And if it's not, like, if it isn't in print, it's questioned if it's true or if it has happened.
Mm.
And then
So it does mark kind of the change in culture, but it also marks its legitimacy because now we have a record for it.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Were you? I was not familiar with this Lewis Mumford. I don't know if you were or not.
I don't think so. I
Okay.
don't think I was. So I'm curious because, and this covers in the next chapter, the typographic mind. But if the written word was gaining that sort of, I said sanctity earlier, uh, it, why is it deserved? And what did it do? You think it did? I mean, he talks about later how it changed how people, thought. It changed how people talked, because at a time people were talking more akin to the written word. If you read speeches from, the Continental Congress or the Federalist stuff, and Alexander Hamilton's speech is not dissimilar from his Federalist paper writings, and there's an interesting thing there, because I'd argue that the spoken word strayed farther from the written word much before television.
Okay, so why do you think this was considered sanctimonious? Well, that had to be a slow progression. That's obviously Postman's view, and that kind of develops over time, and I think he'll create a compelling argument to show why it's maybe why he holds it on a higher pedestal, because he's going to lay out the benefits of it versus the other mediums that we have.
Mm-hmm.
A reason for being sanctimonious in early here in the 17th century. Well, he does talk about how, and I think this was mentioned in a previous chapter, how a reading kind of became like an individual thing. So now that became more personable. Maybe that lended to why it was more sanctimonious. But I think to say sanctimonious, I think it's in large credence to just showing the cultural shift. And I think that's maybe why it was maybe sanctimonious, because now the culture was oriented around it and everybody was doing it. And it was I don't know, I guess it was a matter taken rather seriously. I think he talks about that in, I don't want to get too far ahead, but in chapter 4 he talks about how typography forms a medium that was focused on logic and rationality. So this wasn't something taken very lightly. This was something that you devoted your full attention to. You weren't like multitasking or doing whatever else like you would today.
Sure. I do. One of the things in chapter 3 that I sort of take issue with a little bit is, if we're talking about how colonial America was like super literate, which again, it was good for the time. The literacy rate is higher now, but reading comprehension might be lower, or it hasn't changed much. But he is being kind of idealistic. The thing I take issue with is this, and I know this is his point with amusing ourselves to death, how our sensibilities have changed, how our interests have changed. If you're saying we were interested in reason and logic and learning in a real meaningful way, where we've shifted to entertainment, I think that's being a little rose tinted glasses, because, people still had entertainment. They still liked sport. They still liked watching whatever. So like, if he's talking about watching football or advertising commercials or something like that, or watching the Super Bowl and comparing it to Thomas Paine's Common Sense, or when he talks about Dickens, how Dickens was heralded as, when he came to America, like he was a pariah, or he was a superstar. He was like a huge celebrity, and because people had read his work and he was a big deal. And he compares him to Michael Jackson. But I don't, so I get that what he's saying is we've shifted our desires into entertainment. Now, Charles Dickens is entertaining as well. It's been proven is timeless classics and has been, adapted into many different mediums a lot of times. And Michael Jackson is also entertainment. I don't know if he seems to think that one is better than the other. He seems to think that Charles Dickens is of a greater importance and worthy of celebrity status than Michael
Hmm.
Jackson. And I sort of reject the notion that someone like Michael Jackson is the cause of, this Huxleyan dystopia where we're just consumed by entertainment, because I don't know though, like that's still writing. I mean, there's writing in songs, right? There's art there. There's writing in TV and film too that has tremendous meaning and can have tremendous impact.
Yeah, I don't think that still has like the same intellectual impact. And I would say, well, to go back what I said earlier, I think somebody like Dickens, sure, it was, it is entertainment, but given the context of the time period, I'm not sure that it was. Like, I don't think describing it as
Well,
entertainment would have been super accurate.
okay. Well, but if you're reading a fictional novel, I mean, what are they? They're trying to. If you, let's say you read A Tale of Two Cities or something like The Great Expectations, I think those are Charles Dickens. But if you read those, I mean, I guess maybe you're getting a perspective from across the pond, so to speak, or there's morality plays that are happening within those stories that can like teach you about human nature or culture or something that makes it worthwhile. But you're reading a story. I mean, and if stories, if in the Joseph Campbell like myth making ways, or if you go to Socrates or Plato or Aristotle or anything like that, myth and story are useful for things, just like the Bible it has stories that are useful for things, and sometimes they're for entertainment, and maybe other times not. I don't. Why don't you think those books are entertainment? Because you think people are like, what are they reading them for? Like Dickens, I mean.
Well, that's a fair question. Do you know? Oh, here I found the page. Okay. I don't know. I mean, this has to be pretty early on in transitioning from reading just print newspaper to books.
And flyers. There's a lot of flyers being passed
Yeah,
around.
it mentioned flyers and
Pamphlets.
pamphlets,
Yeah.
and I think it was this chapter did it talk about how much like somebody like Thoreau and Emerson and they were how much they were paid to like give these talks and how much money were people were paying to attend these I guess seminars. I don't know, but I don't know. I feel like I can't give a good argument for your question without really focusing in on it only in that time period, and I can't help but feel that this wasn't like a community event like oh let's go to a concert, let's go see a show.
Mm-hmm.
This was like a scholarly activity.
Mm-hmm.
Like if to compare it to something today, I don't know if you would say that like Jordan Peterson or Sam Harris giving their talks was entertainment. Well, like sure, I guess it is, but I don't think that would be a little misleading in my opinion to say I think it's
Yeah.
drawing a crowd of intellects largely, and sure it's entertaining, but yeah, that's not how I would describe it.
Crowd of intellects, huh?
What, dude? A crowd of people that like what they're saying and like to learn.
You got it.
What
Got
do
it.
you
Got it.
want
Got
from
it.
me,
Got it. Got it.
man?
Got it. That's it's just an interesting characterization of those two particular people's audience.
I don't
Shots
think it
fired.
is at all. I don't know. It's drawing learners, people that love to learn, and they're somehow becoming. I don't know. I think it's cool that we're starting to see like academics and scholars kind of start to get put in the spotlight a little bit, trying to make like sort of somewhat celebrities out of it,
Mhm.
you know, instead of just praising like all the actors that we currently do. And I don't know, I'm sure there's plenty of other people doing that, but those are just like the two that I'm most familiar with
Yeah.
kind of doing that.
Yeah. So part of this chapter also talks about the printing press, literacy, reading in America in relation to education and schools, and as you said, newspapers and pamphlets and flyers. But there's segments here about schools, and with that comes sort of what we're describing, like lectures, like public talks or private talks with an audience that on the bottom of chapter 39, it says, in addition, they were astounded by the near universality of lecture halls in which stylized oral performance provided a continuous reinforcement of the print tradition. So if you're talking about Jordan Peterson or Sam Harris giving a talk, that's like continuing it's continuing from print, right?
Sure.
It's not improv, even if some of it is improvised. It's not entertainment necessarily. It's, talking in a literary way about sometimes literature that they've written or work that they've done. And the lecture halls at this time, one was like for higher education. It was, for adults most of the time. But why are in what ways do those continue the print tradition, and in what ways does a lecture reinforce it to you?
Are you asking me in the context of back then or now?
Both.
I'm not sure. I think it's more of a. Well, I could compare it to podcasts, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of like a public event, I think it was more of a. I feel like I'm repeating myself, but it was more of cultural, and it was more a community event as opposed to reading by yourself. So this was
Mm-hmm.
an effort to bring people in mass together, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah. What were the makeups of the crowds at the time, in early America, either the 17th century, 18th century, 19th century? There's a quote here, that is from Josiah Holbrook, a New England farmer, I believe. Let me see here. No, Alfred Bunn, an Englishman on an extensive tour through America, reported in 1853 that practically every village had its own lecture hall. He added, "It is a matter of wonderment to witness the youthful workman, the overtired artisan, the worn-out factory girl rushing after the toil of the day is over into the hot atmosphere of a crowded
mm,
lecture room." So we're having, blue collar people, we're having
yeah,
women, we're having older people, we're having
sounds like
people
damn
who,
near everyone, man.
it's just a wide array of demographics there that are all sort of congregating to participate or to witness these lectures. And then that little thing continues, that the lecture halls sometimes jammed with capacity of audiences 1,200 and 1,500 people. And then among the lecturers these audience could hear were the leading intellectuals, writers, and humorists who were also writers of their time. And at the bottom, then it continues that the point of all this is leading to is that from its beginning until well into the 19th century, America was dominated by the printed word and an oratory based on the printed word as any society we know of. And go ahead.
Well, we're getting to the close end of the chapter here. So I was gonna read this quote I had by Tocqueville, which kind of just
You just got me that book, his book.
yeah, which kind of further just kind of compounds what you just said. But I'll read it
Okay.
here. It's on page 42.
Okay.
An American, he wrote, cannot converse, but he can discuss, and his talk falls into a dissertation. He speaks to you as if he was addressing a meeting, and if you should chance to become warm in the discussion, he will say gentlemen to the person with whom he is conversing. This odd practice is less a reflection of an American's obstinacy than of his modeling his conversational style on the structure of the printed word. Since the printed word is impersonal and is addressed to an invisible audience, what Tocqueville is describing here is a kind of printed orality, which was observable in diverse forms of oral discourse. So, I mean, that's just a regurgitation of what I think is the main point of this chapter. Sure, there was a lot of specific recounts in history to support his claim, but talking about a printed orality, I think, are the two words, which is what this chapter is about.
Well, it's also that. Thanks for reading that, because it is pointing to, if this whole book is about public discourse, these are examples of how the discourse of the time was influenced. This, as he's pointed out, is largely influenced by the printed word, and so it's the printed orality of it. And so the manner of speaking, even among common folks, not with an audience, was influenced by the printed word. And that offers some specific things, like in the quote from Tocqueville, there are certain things that come along with that, in ways we're forming thoughts, in ways we're having a conversation, and just about anything. There's ways in which it being from a printed word, it being impersonal, it being in complete sentences, it being in, using it, having used literary techniques such as metaphor and simile and irony and sarcasm, and taking those things, and you understand them from literature, and those all are then present in the public discourse, and that's sort of pervasive through New America, which we will contrast to what he might say is happened since television and what it's done to public discourse, because that's the main thing. And so the printed orality that you said, I think, that's a big takeaway concept of this chapter, and then the printed orality of public discourse, I would say.
So I think that's a pretty good summation there. Unless you have lasting thoughts on this chapter, because that does kind of seem to be a good segue point into what is the next chapter of the typographic mind, and how this printed orality kind of starts to structure the mind in both how we perceive information and produce it.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to read any of the Marx quote at all, or
if you wanted to?
Well, so at the very end of the chapter, he's talking about Karl. He gives a quote for him, but he says Marx understood well that the press was not merely a machine, but a structure for discourse, which both rules out and insists upon certain kinds of content, and inevitably a certain kind of audience. And then at the end, he says Marx didn't do this, and Postman will attempt to explore how the press worked as a metaphor and an epistemology to create a serious, rational public conversation. And this is what Neil Postman would say, that from which we have now been so dramatically separated. So if we tie in, you can sort of see the progression from the first chapter to the second chapter to the third chapter, where we're calling out sort of the media is the metaphor, the media is the epistemology. Now we're saying that the printing press itself and the printed word is the metaphor and the epistemology in which discourse is structured around. And then we continue. So I think it's a good time to move on to the chapter 4.
Okay, so chapter 4, the typographic mind. I'll probably leave it off to you here, because I think you are particularly interested in what this first large chunk of the chapter is about, which is about the debates between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas.
Yeah, did I say Frederick Douglass earlier? My bad.
Did you?
I think so. So these are the presidential debates in the 1850s.
Yep,
I believe.
August 21st, 1858, Ottawa, Illinois.
Right. And they had a debate structure that was, one would go for an hour, then the other would go for an hour and a half to rebuttal, and then they would take, a half hour, and they would go back and forth.
Pretty much
And
just however long it took is how it sounded.
yeah, sometimes it was a very long thing,
Yeah,
right?
I like how he mentioned what I think it was. I think Douglas talked for like 3 hours or something, and he was like, "Okay, I willing." Lincoln was like, "I'm willing to respond to all these points, but just so you know, it's probably going to take me 3 hours to respond.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
prepare yourselves." And then people like were sent home to go and like rest and eat dinner, and then they came back and regrouped for the rest of the debate, which I thought was, I don't know, I thought that was pretty cool. I think just the cult, like what we talked about in the previous one, but now this is another example of just the culture around these sort of events. I thought that was super interesting.
So yeah, I did want to read this because I read this to my dad as we were going through it. One of the quotes that Lincoln said in a response at the next debate, where he says, well, first, I'll talk about Lincoln in his reply read even longer passages from a published speech he had delivered on a previous occasion. For all of Lincoln's celebrated economy of style, his sentence structure in the debates were intricate and subtle, as was Douglas's. In the second debate of Freeport, Illinois, Lincoln rose to answer Douglas in the following words. It will readily occur to you that I cannot, in half an hour, notice all the things that so able a man as Judge Douglas can say in an hour and a half. And I hope, therefore, if there be anything that he has said upon which you would like to hear something from me, but which I omit to comment upon, you will bear in mind that it would be expecting an impossibility for me to cover his whole ground. Now that's one sentence. That's a single sentence. And it is so eloquently saying like, look, I can't fucking, because now what we say is like,
point.
can't fucking say, I can't address everything that guy said. So just, I'm going to address what I can. And if I can't, just come on, bear with me here. But he said it in such a way. And the audience probably largely comprehended that and understood in so many words what he meant. And they were like, wow. Now, Douglas continues, this book was written in 1985. He says, it is hard to imagine the present occupant of the White House being capable of constructing such clauses in similar circumstances. And if he were, he would surely do so at the risk of burdening the comprehension or concentration of his audience. So this is Reagan era, right? And it's post Nixon, it's post JFK. And we noted that JFK and Nixon were the first televised debates. And so now we're into debates being televised and what that means. And if we compare that to the most recent debates, especially that first one, which you had a good laugh when you interrupted, but not in a good way, because we were dumbfounded, I would say. I wonder how much of, I wonder if we looked at debates, so pre-televised debates, but 100 years after, not quite 100 years, but a long time after Lincoln. So if we go to the early, like the 1920s or the 40s, and we look at presidential debates, if we had already started to see sort of a move away from this sort of eloquence and this sort of debate structure at large. I mean, so think about, you have an hour and a half, you have a half hour, you have an hour, you have an hour. What do we do now? On the televised debates, it's, here's a question, Mr. President, or whoever, candidate, former vice president, whatever it is, you have 60 seconds to answer, and then you have a minute to respond. Don't interrupt, but they do. And it's really like you have fucking such a short amount of time to try to do something.
It's quite comical.
That's absurd in comparison. Now, part of it is because the audience, in large part, is the audience. Now, it's a feedback loop of the audience getting dumb, like stupefied, or getting dumber, or getting less of attention span, or is less comfortable or able to comprehend complex sentence structure and complex ideas laid out in a logical pattern in such a way that they get lost. And then it makes the politicians have to
What
try
makes you
to
say that? It sounds like you're just like speaking to the illiteracy of America. And
not
I
the
mean,
illiteracy necessarily, but the reading comprehension.
he does
And
say that it was the quote you're reading from the book. In the next sentence, it said, "People of a television culture need plain language, both
Mhm,
orally and visually." And
yes, the
so it
Gettysburg
sounds like
Address.
you agree with that. And I read that and I was just questioning it. I guess I didn't. If you want to answer that a
Okay,
little bit more clearly,
well,
why you think that,
so
and why Postman
I'm.
thinks that.
This is going to come off as condescending. This is going to make me feel like an elitist prick. I feel somewhat okay about my comprehension skills and my understanding of either printed word or even stuff that or listening to a lecture. And it could be complicated stuff. It could be stuff that I don't know anything about. If I read a scientific paper about visualizing imagery in your head and what it means for your
Sure.
high visualizer of this or that, I feel pretty good about like being able to grasp what's in front of me. I can read it and say, okay, I see what this is saying. Now, I don't know if a majority of people can, or if they can read the words. I don't know if they can draw the logical conclusions of what those words mean and what's being said. So when he says the Gettysburg Address would probably have been largely incomprehensible to a 1985 audience, I think to a 2020 audience, that's the same. I mean,
Mm,
many, and there are people who can read the Federalist Papers, for example, or could listen to someone akin to Alexander Hamilton speak in that way. I don't know if the general population in America can or wants to understand those things.
I think that's fair. If you continue reading with what we're at here, it even goes on to say, put 7 interrogatives to Lincoln, all of which would have been rhetorically pointless unless the audience was familiar with the Dred Scott decision, the quarrel between Douglas and President Buchanan, the disaffection of some Democrats, the abolition platform, or Lincoln's famous House divided speech at Cooper Union. So you're right. There is a lot of heavily referenced points there, which
Yes,
would compound with what you're saying here.
and so if we were to have a modern day presidential debate and we wanted to get into the intricacies of geopolitical uh, uh, diplomacy, we need the audience to be able to understand the intricacies of the Israeli-Palestine conflict, or Syrian conflict, or Yemen-Saudi Arabia conflict, or even just diplomatic stuff. Like if we're talking about trade deals, if we're talking about NAFTA or whatever, we need the audience to understand that. Do they? Because I know many people who will talk about the Iran nuclear deal, for example, or the Paris Climate Accord, and say, well, those were bad deals. We had to get out of them, so it was good that we did. Now, I've heard my dad say that. I've heard people at work say similar things, and I don't work in a place that's largely filled with, I would say, people who have a high, reading comprehension or in-depth understanding of international nuclear proliferation and complex deals between various states to reduce global warming. I don't, but what they do have is they say that was a raw deal, so I don't want the Paris Climate Accord, and it was good we got out of it. I don't want the Iran nuclear deal, it was good we got out of it. We don't have the, and that this is on purpose from the people in power who are maybe acting in bad faith. They don't want us to understand the intricacies of the war on terror or the war on drugs or the police issues or race issues or economic issues or any of it. They don't want us to the people, the rabble, the peons, the proletariat. We don't want them to understand these complex things because we can just get away with slogans and 1 minute things. And meanwhile, we can be shifty eyed fucks and manipulate the whole thing. Because if people did understand these complex issues, I think things would be different.
I enjoyed that. Thank you for sharing. That was
I just got really, really upset.
well, made for good discussion. That was quite compelling. I appreciate your passion.
Okay, and here's something that I don't like to say because again, it comes off as elitist, but it's something that my parents say is that most people are dumb. And they're like, Adam, you have to understand that most people are dumb. They're not going to get. You could say anarcho-syndicalism to someone, and they're going to be like, "Well, I no." But if you say, the Black Lives Matter are Marxist, fucking whatever, people are like, great. And so our friends can call people Marxists and say, like, I understand what that means. I get it, and it's really. I don't like to think that people are stupid by and large. I like in the same way I don't like to think that people are mean. I want to think people are kind, like well-meaning and smart people. When you say think of the person or like the average person or whatever, and half the population is stupider than that. And that's what we mean to put it. Are less able to comprehend to the same degree as others. If we're putting it on an average, it's disappointing. And there's a point to it. Part of it is, and this is, again, it's on purpose, and part of it is from television, this erosion, and part of it is now online. And there's powers at play there. The other thing I want to say is I wonder if the people in power can competently say they understand these things. One of the things I like about certain leaders right now is their willingness to say, I don't understand that yet. I'm going to attempt to listen to people who do, and I'm going to form my opinions around that. So AOC talking about the intricacies of the House and how it operates and the entrenched power that is there and sort of what things happen as far as party leadership within the House are complicated issues that most people don't understand. Now, I don't know if she understood when she was elected, but I think now she does, having been a part of it. And it's those kind of leaders that sort of admit when they don't know and show their curiosity and their willingness to learn and their excitement to learn that give me hope. I wonder where that is in the public. The idea of no stupid questions, I think that's a fine idea. I mean, on its base, it makes sense. Questions can be asked stupidly, but one thing that Christian yesterday, a friend, sort of asked if he didn't know what Discord was, and he said it one time, and he asked me what it was, and he said, I'd heard people talk about it before, but I didn't want to ask them what it was because I didn't want to come off as stupid. And I said, that doesn't come off as stupid. It just comes off as curious and willingness to learn. You got to be comfortable asking.
I feel like no stupid questions. Okay, yeah, I see, but it's the reason that we say that is I think that because it crafts a really healthy culture, right? It does allow people to be curious and then ask, because if you're just thinking, oh, I don't want to ask because it might be stupid, that's throttling the learning. So we try to lay this blanket statement down and try to stick to that rule because it's just a healthy rule for all of us to go by.
It's fostering a community,
absolutely,
of learning, of pursuit of knowledge that previously is unobtained. This was a big sidebar.
Well, we stepped into your territory, but I think it was largely successful. Thank you for sharing. I enjoyed that.
Yeah, there's another on the next page, at the bottom, 47. It says, to understand the audience to whom Lincoln and Douglas directed their memorable language, we must remember that these people were the grandsons and granddaughters of the Enlightenment, the American version. So they were the progeny of Franklin, Jefferson, Madison, and Tom Paine, the inheritors of the Empire of Reason. And that's, he continues that to say some of whom were barely literate, and some people didn't speak English. And the photograph and telegraph are becoming there. And it's sort of, He describes it as a new epistemology that would put an end to the empire of reason.
So when people say the age of reason, were they talking about the period of the Enlightenment? I've heard that phrase a few times.
Ooh, sometimes I think can be talked about in different contexts, because like if here, for example, he's talking about the Enlightenment in America, or the Age of Reason for America, which in the Enlightenment period in Italy, or like post like Dark Ages stuff, is like slightly different. So he tries to illustrate and he says he's illustrating the power of typography to control the character of that discourse, and that's why he brings up these Lincoln Douglas debates. And I don't know if I should read this just for contrast, read a quote from Douglas here that's at the bottom of 48, or you could read it, to have sort of the comparative nature of, a Lincoln quote from these debates in the 1850s to a Douglas quote.
Sure, I can read that. This, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I appear before you. No.
Can you do it like a Douglas? Ladies and gentlemen, do it in like an 1850s voice.
You can do that yourself then, if you if you really want that. Go for it, man.
No, go ahead.
You're apparently so obsessed with your little.
Go.
Ladies and gentlemen, I appear before you today for the purpose of discussing the leading political topics which now agitate the public mind. By an arrangement between Mr. Lincoln and myself, we are present here today for the purpose of having a joint discussion. As the representatives of the two great political parties of the state and union, upon the principles in issue between those parties. And this vast concourse of people shows the deep feeling which pervades the public mind in regard to the questions dividing us.
So Postman says this language is pure print, and it is. Now, those speeches were probably prepared with some quick thinking.
Even their rebuttals heavily prepared.
Right. So Postman asks the questions then, what are the implications for public discourse of a written or typographic metaphor? What is the character of its content? What does it demand of the public? What uses of the mind does it favor? How do we update this and to 85 when the book was written, and now to 2020 in the internet age and social media?
Interesting question.
What are the implications of public discourse of a online metaphor? What is the character of the content of social media? What does social media content demand of the public? And what uses of the mind does social media content favor? Because I have ideas.
Well, the print culture was largely demanding of the logical portion of the mind, versus the television is more of the emotional, if you're going to talk about social media, or, since it's all about what can attract the most attention, it's no longer about the logic, it's about the emotion. And that, I don't know, I guess that's the first thing that comes to my mind.
Right. And this, that guy on the Joe Rogan, remind me his name? Tristan Harris, which he shouted out this book at the end of that. At the time of the Douglas Lincoln debates, what are they trying to do? Well, as they both discussed, they're trying to have a conversation about the political issues that are dividing the nation along party lines. What possible solutions does either candidate have to solve, the issues that are dividing us? And so what they're actually sincerely trying to espouse and make clear what their intentions are to address real problems. And then the people also are interested in solving those problems and think these men or these people have the ability to do them, and maybe they just have a difference of ways in which to do them. It's not, and this is still true to some extent. There's sometimes an agreement on the issue, and the disagreement is on how to address the issue, right? And so they're pointing to a particular kind of thing, and uses of the mind it favors are rational. As you pointed out, and as Stone pointed out, if the age of social media, what is its goal? Is its goal to hold your attention? Is it goal to sell you something for advertisements or TV or something? Is the goal to and bringing that up and compare, because I think the sincere goal of the Douglas Lincoln debates is to attempt to impart knowledge to the people and get them on board with the strategies proposed. Now, on social media, that's not the goal. The goal is to get your eyes there and keep you there on a particular site or a particular page for longer.
It's not really about being articulate anymore. It's about, well, what do you guys see said before? It's a plain language, because that's going to draw in probably the most amount of people possible. If there's words in there that people aren't going to understand, then that's not going to attract their attention.
It's also
go ahead.
What uses of the minds does it favor? Such an interesting question, because what uses of the mind does just holding attention for as long as possible or getting as many clicks as possible, what uses of the mind does that favor? And Tristan Harris talks about this too. It favors conspiracy. It favors outrage. It favors fear. It doesn't favor, the boring rational logic or even, any positive thing. It favors these ways in which we can just keep going down rabbit holes into the abyss. And that's because of its goal. And so it has to favor uses of the mind that are very different from the uses of the mind that the Lincoln and Douglas debates favored. It has to. Oh, it doesn't have to. It does, though, here. And if we're talking now, we're also talking about making money. So if the goal is to have attention, have clicks, and earn dollars, now that's another incentivizing thing. How do you earn dollars? We have to really try to identify those uses of the mind that it favors. And one of the things that I said to you in that group chat when I brought up this book, I said we're amusing ourselves to death. Conspiracy, disinformation, fear, and what else did I say? Not outrage, but shit, I can't remember now.
Most of it.
Fuck. Conspiracy. Oh. Panic. Conspiracy, disinformation. All those things will be the death of us because they're profitable. They've proven to be, because they're also dangerous. And they're, for some reason or another, able to attract and work on the mind in a way that other things aren't. So if people are drawn to conspiracy theories, QAnon, or whatever else, that's giving them something that they're drawn to, and they're not looking to logically address what those things are, proposing. Man, I'm angry.
So to continue your point, don't recall where it was in the chapter exactly, but he talks about advertising and how that changed.
Mm-hmm.
Going from, I don't know, it was weird how we embodied it, because I guess advertising used to have some rational logic to it. Like if you were marketing a product, you'd probably actually focus on its function, versus what we're living with today is not like that at all. It's just shifted from, which was apparently logical and rational before, to just manipulating the psyche
Exactly. It's selling an idea
Yeah.
of something instead of selling the product itself.
Yeah. Okay, it's around page 60.
Okay.
But that's jumping way far ahead from where we were.
That's cool.
Okay. Advertising, as Stephen Douglas said in another context, intended to appeal to understanding, not to passions. Boy, that is so foreign to what I've seen in, well, pretty much my whole life.
Yeah. And with the rise of like political ads too, what do those appeal to? Understanding of complex political issues or impassioned controversies over candidates? I like that he says words cannot guarantee their truth content. Rather, they assemble a context in which the question, is this true or false, is relevant. Is the question, is this true or false, relevant in a way today for things we see on TV or things we see on the internet? For me, it is. But is it for other people? Do we have people asking themselves when they see something that looks like it's from a news site that's shared on Facebook by someone they trust or someone they like, and they say, is this true or false? Or do they say, well, it's true or it's false? Like, do they just demonstrably pick one?
Well, I think you obviously have to look at the demographics here, especially if you're, if you're a boomer or something, and you came before this period of the internet. Maybe that transition must have happened so fast from having to ask yourself questions like that to just the proliferation of just false information everywhere. I'm a little bit empathetic to to maybe some of the older people for that reason. I mean, obviously it would be great if if we question most things. It's healthy to be skeptical to a certain extent about most things, but yeah, I'm not sure. I forgot what I was going to say. Kind of my train of thought.
This is also where Postman does talk about the culture in which we've talked about, the culture of which reading was understood, the kind of reading that was going on. So he talks about the farm boy following the plow with book in hand, the mother reading aloud to her family on Sunday afternoon, the merchant reading announcements of the latest clipper arrivals. These were different kinds of readers from those of today. There would have been little casual reading, for there was not a great deal of time for that. Reading would have been a sacred element in it. Or if not that, would have at least occurred as a daily or weekly ritual invested with special meaning. Now, reading is, one, not as common. I mean, how many of our friends don't read books? How many of our parents don't read books? I mean, how many people that I work with don't read books? And that's not to say that books are somehow this amazing thing. They might read tweets, they might read Facebook, they might read articles, or they read the newspaper, but it's different now. He does point out the culture that provides little opportunity for leisure and one that provides a lot, hence amusing ourselves to death, where reading is sort of, to me, it still has kind of a sacred meaning. And I think for you, especially recently, it's a really important part. And there is like an inherent meaning to it when you're sitting down and reading a book for lengths of time.
Yeah, it brings me back to when I first started to engage in a lot more reading, and I remember it was quite difficult to just sit down with a book and read for extended periods of time. A large part also because I don't know, it was so hard to just remain focused. I might even like be interested in what I was reading, but my mind was still kind of wandering everywhere. And I don't know, the more I read it, that starts to become less of a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, I think it's been kind of an interesting experience going from literally almost like reading of no books to
Yeah, reading a lot.
reading a shitload. So
Um, another thing, because we talked about reading comprehension and like the difference of the public or the audience understanding what's being said or what's happening. There's a quote here that I'm going to talk about for speeching and for like a debate, but also for reading something. And he says the modern idea of testing a reader's comprehension as distinct from something else a reader may be doing would have seemed an absurdity in 1790 or 1830 or 1860. What else was reading but comprehending? As far as we know, there did not exist such a thing as a reading problem, except for, of course, those who did not attend school. To attend school means to learn to read, for without that capacity, one could not participate in the culture's conversations. Now, I pointed out earlier, there are people who could read a scientific paper like the one we read for your homework and read the words. They could even read them aloud. They would even, probably they would know how to pronounce all of them. They might even know what a lot of the words mean. But are they taking from that the relevant information and drawing conclusions from what's presented to them? Or are they reading the words? Reading comprehension on standardized tests is you read a thing and they ask you questions about it to see if you understood it or what you remember from it. Part of the difference now is that we don't listen to politicians and comprehend. It's not intended for us to understand. Listening and hearing and reading, for that matter, are now, unfortunately, separated from comprehension.
I think that's eloquently phrased.
Man.
When you put it in pretty simple terms like that, it's actually a pretty shocking just a statement to say. I feel like that would have been hard to foresee happening just because of something like I'm not going to say only the television culture, but a large part of it moving from the rational to the emotionally charged.
Yeah.
We talk about how people don't really listen so much anymore. They're always concerned about what they're going to say back.
At me.
Jesus.
Tag me in a tweet, Joe. Jesus, you're going to at me like that? So in this, he talks about many different examples of sort of moving from the rational and the well-versed to the, passionate, sort of vitriolic nature of stuff. And one of the ones that I thought was really interesting, as we talked about the Bible and we talked about religion at different times, which I have huge problems with religion. But if we look, Postman writes about how preachers and religious scholars of the time were well-versed in scripture, were very, good orators, good storytellers, good writers, and they were able to take those things and impart certain lessons and meanings in a way, using the metaphors and the stories of the Bible, for example, to the congregation, that the congregation could then understand and take with them and take home and put into practice in their lives. And he contrasts that to the megachurch televangelists, where now we have Billy Graham, or we have preachers or we have Joel Osteen, and we have some of the that's a modern day one. Have you seen the some of the modern day like preachers who are just essentially screaming hogwash at their congregation while they congregate? Oh, and they're just screaming it like, the gays need to die. The gays need to die. The gays need to die.
I'm not familiar.
I didn't know your response to the gays thing, the preacher thing.
I was not familiar. The only close thing I can remember is when you linked in Snapchat one time, some dude laughing maniacally about
that shit crazy guy. Yeah, exactly.
I was not familiar with that man.
But they have. Are you familiar with Joel Osteen?
No.
he's got a church with like thousands of people in it that all think he's just like the absolute best, you know. And what's interesting is, you know, comparing to the current pope, who's more of a progressive than previous ones, and the way he talks about things is so different from what many preachers do. I've seen a lot of crazy preacher videos. There's one last part before we conclude that I wanted to read. It's on the last page, but and then we can kind of just give our like parting thoughts and stuff, if that's
Okay,
cool with
yeah, I
you.
kind of had a slow closing statement or quote a little
Yeah.
bit as well.
Yeah, so I wanted to read the one on 63 that's, for 2 centuries, America had declared its intentions, expressed its ideology, designed its laws, sold its products, created its literature, and addressed its deities with black squiggles on white paper. It did its talking in typography, and with that as the main feature of its symbolic environment, rose to prominence in world civilization. He's calling this period of 2 centuries the Age of Exposition. And he's contrasting that with the age of show business. And we will see why now we declare our intentions, express ideology, design laws, sell products, create literature, and address deities in a much, much different way than we had for a amount of time in our history, and what the implications of that are when we move from designing our laws influenced by one way versus influenced by the other.
Boy, have there been many unforeseen ones so far.
Oof.
Yikes.
Can you give me your parting thoughts here?
Sure. One last part that I thought was particularly interesting. I'll read it right here. Page 61. Think of Richard Nixon or Jimmy Carter or Bill Graham or even Albert Einstein.
Yeah, Billy Graham. He's a televangelist.
And what will come to your mind is an image, a picture of a face, most likely a face on television screen. In Einstein's case, a photograph of a face. Of words, almost nothing will come to mind. This is the difference between thinking in a word-centered culture and thinking in an image-centered culture.
Yeah, I mean, is that true for you?
To a certain extent, I think so.
So yeah, an image of Nixon comes to mind, but I also, there's like, and this is probably part of TV too, there's the quotable moments, right? There's the moments of, I am not a crook. You got to get the jowls moving, or you know, he says like, what's the meanest way I can say, or you know, whatever. And JFK is like, I did not have sex with Marilyn Monroe. I'm JFK. Please don't shoot me. I did have sex with Marilyn Monroe.
Do you well, it sounded like you didn't fully agree with that statement. What are your thoughts?
Well, for me, myself, like I do think of some things those people have said, but if it's I'm not a crook, that's just a quotable little soundbite from something that was probably televised, right? So that's living in the plain language. That's living. I don't remember their State of the Union addresses, and I don't remember things they published. I do remember JFK's like letter he wrote to like Harvard to like get accepted, and it was basically just like, my daddy went here, and I'm a Kennedy.
Wow.
Yeah. Einstein, yeah, it's mostly the image. I mean, you remember some of the stuff that he did. Billy Graham, I'm just not familiar with because I don't like him.
I'm not either.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a strange state of affairs. What about when you think of Lincoln? Because we've been talking about him so much. Do you obviously think of a top hat and a tall guy, and he's closeted gay, and his wife is really depressed and going insane, Mary Todd, but you also think of the Emancipation Proclamation, you think of the Gettysburg Address, and you do think of some of the seminal works in writing, but you also do think of an image of Lincoln, right? Like immediately with Lincoln, people think of Daniel Day-Lewis, you know?
Yeah. Well, it's hard to say. With the examples given here in the quote that I read, those aren't necessarily figures that I'm like quite familiar with.
Right.
And maybe I am slightly more familiar with Lincoln, but having said that, how much of his I haven't read much of his writing, if any. Sure maybe I've read some
You've
passages,
heard
you know,
some of the
like
Gettysburg Address and stuff. 407 years ago.
so just a few, but it's still pretty limited. So I don't know. I think
Here's, can I ask you another question?
sure.
What comes to mind when you think of Foucault? What comes to mind when you think of Socrates? Are you thinking of their written word, or are you thinking of the person or an image of them? I'm thinking of the written word.
Yeah, I think so. Well, with Foucault, it's definitely the written word. With Socrates, it mostly is, but I I think it is a little bit fun to conjure up a picture of Socrates in my mind because knowing like the description given for what he looks like, he was like some like damn near like vagabond, like homeless guy, and he's using like rhetoric to like feed himself. So it's there is a little bit of a picture in my mind, and especially since we don't have we don't have like the works of Socrates, you know. We
Mm-hmm.
have, you know, what Plato had to say about him and try to
Mm-hmm.
embody his positions. So that maybe lends credence to why I do have a picture. But yes, I am also largely thinking about some written word,
Here's another
especially
one that's
contrasted
just,
to
yeah.
the other examples we just
This
gave.
is an example, I think, of how one of these things has changed, and it's a big one. At a certain time, preachers or religious scholars, when asked about things in the King James Bible or asked about Jesus, were they thinking of Jesus's teachings, or were they thinking of Jesus as the white hippie savior from the Middle East, that the image of Jesus is commodified in such a way now that when you talk about Jesus, I don't know if his teachings are the immediate thing. I think at one point, his teachings probably were the first thing people think of. Now, the first thing people think of is probably the crucifix or
Yeah.
whatever image of Jesus they've been indoctrinated with. And now it's Jesus the image, not Jesus the meaning.
Hmm. It's a pretty good example, I think. I don't like the implications of that. I know you don't
Nope.
watch Sunny in Philadelphia too much, but now there's this line. He goes, "I want that Jesus on a cross physique." That's maybe what I'm thinking. Just a shredded, starving Jesus getting crucified. That's the picture in my mind.
But also
Influenced by pop
it's the
culture television.
it's the whitewashed Jesus. It's all the ways that Jesus is depicted now. It's even not the like largely socialist Jesus that he was in his day, where now it's a prosperity Jesus, or the, you know, supply side Jesus, is that excellent comic by I think Al Franklin wrote, um, where Jesus is now, and I'll use the word commodified again, in such a way that's divorced from the written. Very uncomfortable. Yikes. But as we continue to go through this book and to go through this little series of shows, we're going to try to be optimistic about some things. I don't want to be doom and gloom. There are things that we can do to change this. How do we get reading comprehension better? How do we get people? How do we improve people's ability to ask, is this true or false? And give them the tools to definitively figure that out. And then how can we foster an environment that encourages that?
I think that's probably the big question. I don't know if we can if we keep the same structures in place that we have now, social media and just general news media, just manipulation of the psyche versus the rationale, emerging sciences in I don't know, even in like some of my neuroscience classes, we start to learn how people in marketing are targeting certain parts of the brain. You can take an MRI and see how people respond to certain things. I think there's a good neuroscientific basis to like slogans and the little rings that get stuck in your head. So I don't know if we could combat these types of things, these environmental influences, by just sheer I don't know, like I guess what you said with just good education, trying to increase literacy, asking people to just take it upon themselves and kind of, try to fight back. I don't think we can do that. We do have to somehow change these systems that we have in place now.
And it's a dramatic restructuring of society.
Yes, it is. So
But
yes, these are big questions.
hopefully we can do that. Hopefully we can do that. Well, if anyone was listening, thanks for listening or watching or whatever. And we're going to keep going through this, and hopefully you find it interesting and informative and fun, maybe. I don't know.
Great.
Oof, that was a rough one. I am worked up.
You did a good job, man.
Oh boy.
I think the next one will go well, like the first two kind of did.
Yeah,
well,
the
they're
next
more
one.
just philosophical in nature versus history.
This one had a slow start once we got
it did have a slow start,
but
we got there was some good stuff in actually the more we talked about it. Oh shit, stop recording.